Donc, bienvenue à la conférence plénière de la journée EPHN 2020 qui se tient donc le 2 octobre, après de nombreux rebondissements, et où nous allons travailler sur la mise en œuvre des humanités numériques dans les pratiques pédagogiques. Et nous avons le plaisir ce matin d'accueillir Claire Warwick, qui est professeure en humanités numériques et qui a eu une carrière impressionnante. Elle vient du département d'anglais. Elle a longtemps travaillé à UCL, au département des Information Studies, et elle a dirigé le Centre pour les humanités numériques, Center for Digital Humanities, à UCL. Et elle s'intéresse particulièrement à la manière dont on mobilise les ressources numériques dans le domaine des humanités et de ce qu'on appelle en anglais le cultural heritage, donc tout ce qui est le patrimoine, aux usages des réseaux sociaux et aux pratiques de lecture. Et donc, ça l'a amené à travailler de manière très intéressante, à la fois sur les modes de lecture, la muséographie, l'archéologie, la recherche documentaire, les pratiques des usagers et le maniement de Twitter. Donc, un spectre très, très large. Et elle a aussi, évidemment, une large expérience en matière d'enseignement à partir du numérique. La dernière chose que je vais citer, c'est l'ouvrage collectif de 2006, Digital Humanities in Practice, publié à Londres, et qui va nous amener à la conférence qu'elle va nous donner aujourd'hui en anglais, intitulée Binary Codes. Thank you very much, Professor Warwick, for being with us. And the floor screen is yours.
Thank you very much.
We have, it's good, we're hearing you.
Okay, great, fantastic. I wish I could be in Paris with you, but in this particular situation, I'm here in Cambridge. I'm sorry that the background behind me is dark, but it being England, it's raining and miserable. So I would much rather be in Paris with you, but I will do my best to create a connection between us one way or another. So today I'm going to talk, as Claire said, about my experience of teaching digital humanities, of creating master's courses in particular for digital humanities in England. So I will start. I will just start with the typical slide about defining digital humanities, since we I think we all pretty much do that these days. I'm looking forward to a time when it's not actually necessary to produce a definition, but anyway, this is the one I use, which is that I consider digital humanities to be applying digital technologies or computational research methods to research in the arts and humanities, but also in cultural heritage practice, as Claire said, in areas of things like archaeology, museology, galleries, those kind of areas. I also think it's important that we think about using what we might call traditional humanities methods to study digital objects. As Claire said, I've done some work on Twitter. Presently, I've just got that's the screenshot of my book, which is rather old now, but I kind of put it there because, in a sense, we start the book by saying we don't really want to define digital humanities. Lots of people have done that better somewhere else, but that's why I put it there. But at the moment, I'm doing the kind of digital humanities that's using humanities methods because I'm writing a book on the history of cyberspace, particularly in the 1990s. So I guess I've done both sorts of digital humanities, and I think it's very important that we do think about it in both senses, especially when we're thinking about teaching. And also that digital humanities really aims to create new knowledge in whatever part of the partnership one is working. So it's not just humanities scholars doing important research and computer people running around after them, fixing their databases or whatever, or nice people from museums lending the objects. It has to be something that's meaningful for everybody who's collaborating. So, okay, we got that out of the way. Now we can talk about more interesting things. I am going to talk on the basis of my experience of teaching digital humanities, particularly in the context of what we used to do at UCL, so the MA/MSc in Digital Humanities at UCL, that was interesting in the sense that I don't think before or since there have been many courses, well, before we did it, there had not been any courses that were, that gave you a qualification either in an arts and humanities domain, which is the MA, or an MSc, which is a course which gives you a science qualification. So at that time, this was when we set it up, this was at the beginning of, I think, 2011. We were already saying that digital humanities needs to straddle the disciplinary boundaries. At Durham, we are literally starting this year what is a digital humanities course, but very much in the context of science. So as you can see, we're starting a master's in what is called data science, but in digital humanities data science. And that's very interesting because it's being run as part of our Institute for Data Science, which is in itself a product of physics, our Department of Physics, and their collaborations at CERN in terms of particle physics and computational cosmology. So in a sense, what we're doing with digital humanities at Durham is we're taking it right into the science domains, as well as it being very much anchored in the humanities. So that again is a different development, and I'm going to talk about why we're doing that sort of thing shortly. The other logos that I've put across the bottom of here are recognition that I've actually been, I realized that the first time I taught digital humanities, as it then wasn't called, it was then called humanities computing. The first time I taught that was in 1996 when I was doing a postdoc at the University of Oxford. So I've got Oxford there, from which I moved to the University of Sheffield, information studies. So I was teaching, again, it wasn't called digital humanities at the time. I was teaching some digital humanities in the context of various courses in librarianship, information science, digital journalism, no, e-journalism as we called it then. DHSI is, some people may have been to it, I guess, but a very successful international summer school called the Digital Humanities Summer Institute, run by my dear friend and colleague, Ray Siemens in the University of Victoria in Canada. So I've taught at DHSI for a couple of years, and I've seen how it's developed over the years. So again, I'll be reflecting on some of that. And at the moment, I am the external examiner for a master's course at the University of Glasgow, which has long been a leader in digital humanities. I'm not sure how these things are organized in France, but in England, every course, every degree course, whether for undergraduates or postgraduates, has to have an external person who is the kind of, you know, the external assessor, if you like, just to see that everything is being done properly. So at the moment I'm doing that at Glasgow, but I've had experience of working at King's College London and various other places. Equally advising as an external on courses at places in Ireland, at University College Cork and at Trinity College Dublin. I've done a little bit of advice for Yale University and things like that. So I'm not going to go on about that, but the point is it's largely an Anglo-American frame of reference that I'm going to be talking about. This is not to say I have any kind of prejudice against digital humanities in Europe. It's just that it's the discipline has grown up historically in that Anglo-American frame, and I think, you know, we need to think about how it grows outside that. In fact, I was teaching at a summer school in Heidelberg last summer, so it'll be interesting to see how European digital humanities develops from that kind of very Anglo-American dominated context. Right, excuse me if I'm sounding a little coldy. I have not got COVID, I promise. I just have a cold. Right, next one. So I think, taking in my title of binary codes, what I was trying to express there is the sense that I think more and more we are aware that digital humanities must exist in different contexts and in different different disciplinary worlds. And so here I've just produced a little table where I'm kind of summarizing some of the differences and some of the ways that disciplines tend to organize themselves. I think this is actually important for thinking about how we teach our students, how we educate our graduates, because digital humanities doesn't live fully in any disciplinary world. If we think about the fact that in traditional humanities, as we know, it tends to be dominated by single scholar research and single scholar activity. You know, the humanities scholar thinks of themselves as it's the romantic image of the author, the single great authority, the genius, as it were, which is very different from science, of course, which, as we know, is very much team-based. The more important you are, the larger you have, a larger research group you tend to have. So where does digital humanities sit in that? Well, largely it's team-based. And I think it has to be in most cases, because it's very hard to do single scholar digital humanities unless you are doing the kind of thing that I'm doing at the moment, which is writing a book about digital phenomena. But if you want to actually produce digital artifacts or work in kind of digital scientific areas, you really have to collaborate with computer scientists, maybe other different sorts of scientists in terms of archaeology, GIS. We also have a fantastic project at Durham where they're using raster scanners, a technique developed in chemistry, to understand how the pigments for early manuscripts have developed. And that is a collaboration between chemistry and book history. So I think this is one of the important things that students really have to begin to understand, this nature of DH as a collaborative discipline. As a result, what we tend to see is that, again, the way that we publish is different. In the humanities, we still very much value the single authored monograph, even though publishers keep telling us that it's unsustainable. Whereas in science, largely papers are published by research teams. In digital humanities, I think we have a little of both, but I think the multiple authorship paradigm is much more usual. Equally, in science has developed and is developing increasingly across disciplines. I have to say that at Durham we do interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinary work very, very well, but it's not unique to us. Every university is pushing into interdisciplines, particularly in science. Whereas I think in many areas of the humanities, we're still quite attached to the idea of I am a historian or I am a literary scholar. And we may not necessarily find interdisciplinary working as natural, but I think I believe that digital humanities is essentially an interdiscipline. I don't think you can even call it a discipline. It has to reach out to so many areas. And as a result, it's very much, it isn't sure of itself. As I said at the beginning, so many people spend so much time defining digital humanities, and should you wish to have a compendium of that, my former colleagues Julianne Nyhan and Melissa Terrace have produced a fantastic book which brings together huge numbers of discussions about how we define the discipline, called, surprisingly enough, Defining Digital Humanities. And we are still trying to work out what on earth digital humanities is. My view is that we should just get on with doing it and then work it out afterwards. But certainly we are uncertain about that. The field isn't established, it's not fixed. Equally, when we're dealing with data, largely in the traditional humanities, humanities scholars don't create their data. You don't write Hamlet to be able to study Shakespeare. Whereas in science, of course, it's most usual that you will have to create some kind of experimental data before you can study it. And I think that sense of how the data is understood is extremely important in the context of teaching. And of course, we have a mixture of physical and digital objects in science, depending on whether you're doing computational science or lab science. But in digital humanities, the data we're dealing with is largely digital, although, you know, in the rest of my work, I talk about how we need to think about the context of the physical and the digital and how we work between those two worlds. But nevertheless, I think, you know, this quick rundown about the nature of the discipline is just to kind of stress that if we're thinking about how do we educate the next generation of digital humanities scholars, they have to be comfortable in these liminal spaces, you know, existing between these kinds of disciplines and putting the kind of disciplines together. So in my experience teaching digital humanities, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the things, the assumptions I think we have to consider when we're thinking about putting on new programs. You'll see on the edge of the screen from now on some pictures. They are various different things that are relevant to digital humanities, almost all at Durham. Not entirely. This little screenshot here, I'm sure a lot of people will recognize as being from Voyant Tools, that was the brainchild of Stephen Sinclair, who very sadly died a couple of months ago from cancer. And so very, very young. I don't think he was yet 50. So I've kind of put this up here to just as a little tribute to Stefan, who was a great scholar and a great DHer. And so I think, you know, what I'm saying here is there are so many different types of digital humanities. As I've said, we haven't really, the field hasn't decided what it is yet. But as a result, when we're thinking about teaching, we then need to think, well, what sort of digital humanities are we going to teach? You have heard that I'm presently in an English department and my PhD was in English. And for whatever reason, a lot of people who do digital humanities are from English or literary studies. So some courses that are teaching DH are teaching a very kind of literary version of DH, or a version of DH that is very much influenced by media studies, and therefore much more likely to be quite theoretically heavy, both in the context of the amount of material and the difficulty of the material, I think. But so that, you know, that is one kind of DH. The kind of DH we were teaching at UCL was what I would call broad coverage DH, in the sense that we drew on a very large number of disciplines. We were in an information studies department, which I think the most equivalent to that would be something like NCIB in Lyon, which I know is a grande école rather than a university department. But in that same way of thinking about information as an object of study, it allowed us to range far and wide across a lot of different disciplines. And I'll talk a bit more about how that affected how we organize the course. Or are we thinking about DH in a computational context? As I've said, that this is the way we're doing it at Durham, which is going to be very computational heavy and hard for the students. We know this, but that's another way. Equally, increasingly, information professionals and cultural heritage professionals are becoming interested in digital humanities, seeing it as part of their job as an information profession. And certainly in a couple of months' time, I'm going to be participating in a web seminar for the Research Libraries UK group, which is the librarians of all of the top research libraries for universities in the UK. And they are very interested in this kind of digital transition, because they see it as, they see digital humanities, not just digital, they see digital humanities as a fundamental change in the way that their subject works. So again, in a context of an information studies department or something like NCIB, is there a version of digital humanities that's being taught in that context that might be different? Equally, I think the institutional context is very important. Here we have a picture of UCL at the bottom and a picture of Durham at the top. you will notice the difference. Durham is a city of 50,000 people with a university of around about 17,000 students in it. So you can see how much that the university dominates the city. And actually we physically dominate the city, because here you can see the castle, the 11th century castle, which is actually a college of the university. And in fact, we're one of the very few universities to have a World Heritage Site as part of our campus. So you can see that the context of these is very different. UCL is here in the foreground, but in the background, whoa, sorry about that. In the background, you see how London spreads itself out. And those are going to change the context in which you work, because people, not everybody is attracted to a small, old, beautiful little city in the middle of the north of England. Some people may prefer to be in a big, bustling metropolitan centre. And around UCL, there are huge numbers of museums, the British Museum, libraries, galleries, whether they're private or public. There is a whole kind of cultural heritage establishment in London. In Durham, we have huge amounts of fascinating special collections, but not that kind of concentration of cultural heritage. And equally, the industries that are relevant to digital humanities, such as publishing, broadcasting, etc. So I think the geographical context for DH courses is very important. And one of the things that I'm very convinced by is that one cannot simply take a model of digital humanities that works in one university and plant it in another one. And that I really resisted doing that when I moved from UCL to Durham, because they're very, very different institutions. Each of them will have different historical strengths. So as I said, we at Durham, we have a very, very strong physics department who have done a lot of really exciting computational research for many years. And as a result, we have massive supercomputing. The physicists use it almost all, but nevertheless, we have more supercomputing than the whole, anywhere else in the north of England, any other university in the north of England. I mean, UCL does too, but it doesn't dominate the university quite so much. Nevertheless, UCL is also very strong in computer science and engineering. So the kind of DH that we did at UCL was very much collaborative with computer science and engineering. At Durham, the relative strength of the arts and humanities is huge. They are one of the best areas of the university. They're some of the strongest research in the university. At UCL, medicine is very dominant and science is very dominant, and the arts and humanities, while very good, are tiny by comparison. There's 280 academics doing arts and humanities research at UCL in the context of about 10,000 academics. So it's tiny, it's much bigger in Durham. So this is what I mean about thinking about, okay, where are your historical strengths? At Durham, we have a lot of traditional humanities. We are in the middle of a World Heritage Site, but we also remarkably have this extraordinary computing resource. So we had to think, okay, how will that work? UCL has huge diversity of subjects and very strong engineering and science. So how would that work in the context of digital humanities? And I think that, these are examples I can give, but when I was talking to the folks at Yale, and when I've been talking at DHSI, I've always said, you need to think about what is the nature of your university, and therefore what will your version of DH be? And, in the context of French DH, there will be many other considerations as well, most of which I'm sure I'm not conscious of. But equally, one of the things I was particularly impressed by, I used to be on the Conseil Scientifique for Campus Condorcet, and I'm so sorry that I can't be there and see what the new building looks like, because I did see it when it was a hole in the ground, literally. Therefore, I was involved in Project Biblissima, and it was struck me that how impressive it was that universities were collaborating together, but also with the local archives and the local history, if you like. That is something that is not characteristic, for example, of the UK. And it could be a particular strength that French DH might want to build on. Equally, you know, one of the things, I used to be an academic politician, if you like. I was the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research, which I guess is something like being a Vice President or something in French terms. But anyway, I therefore think about the kind of bureaucratic politics of some of this, but I do think it's actually very important in the context of DH. We, as DH scholars, often find ourselves on the edge of various disciplines, as I was saying, and that doesn't always make us popular, whether with traditional humanities scholars who are worried that we're going to ruin the discipline they love, or perhaps with computer scientists who think that what we do is not really interesting in terms of computer science. So we have to think about what alliances can we make if we want to establish DH and keep it going. So I very much think about, you know, who's going to support this initiative, because if they're not going to stand up and support it, it's probably not going to work, because there will be people who actively will not support it. The two little things I've, the picture of the logo here I've put on are emblematic of that, because I think it's very important to think about what the university itself is doing and how digital humanities might fit into it, and indeed how digital humanities might contribute to it. So this happy little picture here is evidence of our having recruited twice as many female computer science students. I mean, that's the twice as many. You can see how relatively few it is, but nevertheless, the university is trying really hard to increase the diversity of our student body in computer science, and indeed our faculty in computer science, because we were aware that it was so male dominated, and that we really must work harder on that. Equally, that we must work harder in terms of diversifying our student body in terms of race, class, etc. And we are working on that one too. But this is a success. But you know, computer science has been thinking a lot about how women fit into the context of computer science. And we know, for better or worse, that female students tend to enjoy doing digital humanities and things where they can see a meaningful output rather than just tinkering about with stuff. And that's not just me observing it. That's been sort of written about in the research for quite a long time. So this was a priority. Computer science was a priority area for the university. Women in computer science was a priority area, and I'm really grateful to my colleagues in computer science. They really got behind the idea of digital humanities and said, well, this sounds great. We think it sounds very exciting. We would like to make some faculty appointments in digital humanities. We'd like to do some collaborative teaching. How can we work with you? Which I was, you know, absolutely delighted by. Equally at UCL, that little logo is the logo of the UCL Grand Challenges, which was an initiative that was being launched around about the time just before we set up UCLDH, with the idea of fostering interdisciplinary research that, as the name suggests, addresses global grand challenges like global health, and intercultural communication, those kind of areas. And so again, the idea that this new interdisciplinary course might fit in with that initiative was very welcome to the senior management. And you know, we were lucky to happen along at that time. And you know, my former colleague David Price, who is the VP Research there, gave us huge amounts of support and help, as did the dean of our faculty. So again, we fitted into a university priority, and we worked hard to see how we could help that. What I tend to find is, you know, not everybody loves digital humanities. As I've said, some traditional humanities scholars are quite worried about it, and it, you know, understandably it causes them some anxiety. My view is that trying to go around and convince people who are unconvinced is not the best plan. The best plan is to work with people who are interested and do want to collaborate with you and are interested. And as I say, I don't know if this translates into French at all, but the English expression about success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. The idea being that if you make a success, lots of people will go around saying it was their idea in the first place. And I'm very happy with that. If other people think that DH is their idea, or DH in a particular university is their idea and they were the person that made it possible, and there's several of them, then that's great, because that means we have support from lots of other bits of the university. And if other disgruntled people decide that they want to oppose it, well, it means you've got some people on your side. So that's the politics. Moving on to, how we have to think about, okay, in this world of collaboration between fields, of trying to find a place for digital humanities, what are the students going to need in terms of skills? This is just a nice little screenshot, by the way, of our one of the manuscripts in the Priory Library, which is at Durham Cathedral. And it's obviously digitized here, and it's one of our really interesting collaborative projects in Durham, called the Ordered Universe Project, is working on this particular manuscript because it's about medieval science. And the collaboration is looking at medieval science and how, particularly how medieval scientists understood the physics of light. And that involved physicists, mathematicians, classicists, historians, and it's produced some amazing material. They've published both in humanities journals and in the top science journals like Nature. So again, I think this is a really good example of how digital resources are integrated into, really, really broad interdisciplinarity. So some of the skills, I mean, the obvious ones are things like students need to understand data, whether it's quantitative data in terms of numerical data or qualitative data, that particularly when I am working with users of digital resources, I'm creating quite a lot of qualitative data from interviews and things like that. So students need to understand how to deal with that. And that's probably something they won't be familiar with from arts and humanities. They clearly need computational skills, but they also do need a deep knowledge of the humanities or of cultural heritage practices, or ideally both. And so obviously we have to think about how those can be balanced. But, and I think almost more importantly than that, or certainly as importantly, are the kind of what some people might call soft skills, but I think of them as vitally important, about how do people work in this interdisciplinary world. So how can you communicate with other people, working in teams, working with users, how to collaborate with people outside universities, ideally in cultural heritage. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a bit more detail as we move towards the end part of my talk. When we're thinking about these skills, as I've said, in terms of data analysis, we probably assume that most students have not got a great deal of experience in these areas. I mean, obviously, a humanities, an object of study in humanities is data in some ways. A text is data. It's just analog data. A piece of music, an art object is in a certain way data, but we don't think about it like that. And pure humanities students don't really think about that as, they don't think of a painting as data really, unless and until they see a digital reproduction of it. So we have to think in terms of what skills do people need when they leave the course? What have they got when they join it? How much have they been doing technical mathematical type work? We generally find that most of our students come in without very much mathematical knowledge. But equally, have they been working in cultural heritage or information work? This is a picture of one of our archaeologists. Oh, I wish it would stop doing this. Who is digging something somewhere, and I'm not sure exactly who he is, but he's one of our Durham archaeologists. Or are they, are they used to that, or are they used to working in the more traditional? Here are a couple of our humanities students. That's the more traditional kind of humanities seminar, small group discussion style. It might be very different to be going into a practical class with lots of computers. Equally, we found at UCL that we had quite a lot of part-time students, many of whom might well be working in things like libraries or museums. And we also had quite a lot of international students from outside the UK. whether from Europe or whether from further afield, many Chinese students, in fact. And again, that brings a whole different flavor to the way you teach. And in fact, I found it very interesting because in effect, the students in many ways taught each other, because people who were mature students and information professionals would talk about, well, you know, in my library, we do this, or in my museum, we've been interested in that. And people might talk about in their home country, this was the assumption about something digital. And it was fascinating to get this mixture of perspectives. So as I say, in a funny way, I actually think that the easier bit is what we might see as the more kind of traditionally pedagogical things. In other words, what do you teach? What's the balance between technical and humanities content? At UCL, we shared a lot of modules from many departments across the university, you know, huge multiplicity of departments, from anthropology to computer science to engineering to art history, and many other traditional humanities disciplines, because we said that all of the students had to do or could do one module in traditional humanities as well as the digital work if they wanted to. So that brought together a huge, if you like, menu of options, which we had to support the students in deciding what they wanted to do. Equally, as I've said, some students found it hard being taught by computer scientists. We know that at Durham, the vast majority of the content of the course will be in computer science. They will be being taught by people who are computer scientists who assume that everybody has mathematical knowledge and think in mathematical ways. Now, in France, I know that people carry on studying maths largely until they leave school, or many people do, and that, you know, doing the science back is considered very, very important and very prestigious. So in France, that's probably going to be less of a problem, but many, if not most, English students who want to study humanities at university, as I did, stopped studying maths at the age of 16. So suddenly having to be taught programming in a mathematical way is going to be a challenge. And we had to support the students at UCL in that, because they found it quite challenging. And I know that students at Glasgow, you know, don't always, many of them come from a library or museum or archives background, and most of them have studied history at university, and they don't always find doing digital things at all comfortable. So I think that is, you know, some of those questions about, okay, what's the balance of modules? Who's going to teach them? What sorts of programming or coding or database or GIS or whatever it might be, what do they need? And that is something that I think, again, every university, every program really has to decide for itself on the basis of the local conditions. And also, of course, it changes. Things change hugely. When I was teaching at UCL, XML was considered extremely important and core to what a digital humanist should do. Now, I think programming, Python, R, those kinds of languages are much more significant, but also the idea that, well, we hope that it's true that at Durham, we believe that actually questions about big data analysis are going to become much more and more important. So students need a very strong background in that, which we didn't think 10 years ago at UCL, because the world changes and the field changes. So as I say, in a sense, I think that's almost the simple bit. The more difficult part is this question about collaboration. Oh dear, sorry about that typo. DH, as I said, I keep saying it exists between the worlds. And I think that DH students, we have to prepare them almost to be interpreters. They have to be able to talk to scientists and to humanities scholars and to members of the public. And therefore we've got to provide them with the experience. We've got to take them to different intellectual cultures, and, you know, they may not find that all that comfortable, but it's incredibly important that we do push the students and we do get them to think about, okay, well, how do mathematicians express themselves? How do statisticians talk? How do scientists work? How do physicists work? And if you need to talk to them, how are you going to find that common ground? Equally, as I've said, cultural heritage. We've got, actually I should have said on the previous picture, that is one of our, that's an amazing 17th century library right in the middle of the cultural, the International Heritage Site that is amazing, and there's extraordinary rare books, and that's part of the university. Equally, this is our supercomputer Cosma, which is a massive data processing machine. But you can see, as I've said, I think that shows you the variety of what we've got in Durham, and that is what the world the students must live in. Equally, here are a couple of pictures. This is our Oriental Museum, which is part of the university, but it's very much a museum. And this is an image of some eye tracking work that colleagues and I have done with Auckland Castle, which is the former residence of the Bishop of Durham, on some 17th century paintings to try and work out how do people look at them using eye tracking. And so that I put those there to emphasize the importance of working with cultural heritage organizations. Some of the students will have come from that background, not all of them by any means, and therefore they've got to be thinking about how does cultural heritage, what languages, if you like, do cultural heritage professionals use? What's important to them? How will I talk to them? How will I collaborate with them? We certainly found at UCL, and I know at Glasgow, they also find that students really enjoy working in cultural heritage settings, whether that's part of an assessed module or whether it's a work placement. They get a huge amount out of that, but somebody has to organize it. You have to work out how to assess it. It's time consuming, but it's certainly something that I think students get a lot out of if you can partner up with cultural heritage institutions or parts of the university like libraries and special collections. That seems to be a very successful part of the course. Equally, as we know, in almost every workplace setting, but in particular in the IT industry, in cultural heritage, in information professions, people work in teams. The fact is that this is a bit of a challenge for students, especially once you come in from traditional humanities, because they have very little experience of working in teams. Some of them, especially those who've come straight from doing an undergraduate degree, they've really been assessed on what they personally do as writing essays or reports or whatever, and they don't find it comfortable to work in teams. But we make them, or we used to make them, certainly because it's just something that they have to learn to do, and they hate it. And my experience was having to persuade them that getting the sense of understanding what other people in your team want, they might be from different disciplines, they might have different assumptions about what success looks like, having to agree what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, having to think about who's going to manage this project. They're all absolutely critical to doing successful digital humanities, but they are not skills the students usually have, and they're not particularly comfortable getting them either. Just to finish, I don't want to talk too much about the pandemic. We all thought about it too much, but this is a picture of my colleague Gordon Love, who is the head of Durham Computer Science, and there he is sitting in his shed during lockdown because he couldn't get to his office, which just shows that we've had to think about, okay, where do we do our work? How does this digital stuff fit in? Everybody's, like we are today, everybody's had to suddenly adjust themselves to working in digital context. And not everybody likes it. Everybody's beginning to realize that actually face-to-face contact is really important, and that digital is beginning to feel a bit second class. Our students very clearly do want social contact. They want face-to-face teaching if they can have it. They want contact with their peers. They're hating being locked down in university residences at other universities. Haven't seen what's happening at Durham yet because they've only just arrived. So, we have to I wonder whether there's going to be a bit of a disillusionment about digital, whether there'll be a kind of, people will want to do anything but digital in future. Therefore, we have to think about, okay, what's that effect of that on digital humanities? But equally, how do we navigate different worlds? How do we think about what's the balance between digital and physical in our teaching, and how will we support students in that sense? So to finish off, this is what I hope we will be seeing this time next summer. I hope we'll be able to graduate the students physically, and that would be them walking up to the cathedral, which is where they graduate. That's right in the middle of the World Heritage Site. In a sense, have I argued that digital humanities people just have to be polymaths? They have to know everything. I don't think they've got to know everything, but I do think they've got to be comfortable about crossing boundaries and recrossing boundaries, and not thinking of themselves as belonging to one particular culture, but thinking of themselves as people who think across boundaries, who are flexible thinkers, who embrace interdisciplinarity, even if they find it difficult. That they are able to work in teams and collaborate with other people, even if those people come from wildly different backgrounds. And that's not going to be easy, but it does make them extremely highly employable, because they will have a lot of the digital skills, but they will also have those other skills of working in different worlds with different kinds of people and being able to interpret between cultures. And I think, to end on, that is not easy, but it's an extremely interesting challenge, and it's something that I find very exciting. And if we can get that right, there is a great future for digital humanities. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Everyone is interested. So as we wrote in, I don't know if you can see the chat box, but
not at the moment.
Not at the moment.
Oh, yep. Hold on. I think I can see it now.
I think if you unshare screen,
yeah,
stop sharing screen.
I've got it now. Yeah.
So we asked participants maybe to type their questions in the chat box, but it's very new. So is there someone who would like to ask a question in French? Is okay. Claire Warwick understands French. If not, I'll mine and type it at the same time. So my question, so I'm in English, so I'll stay in English.
I just want to ask directly, well, we can, but maybe not with the cameras on, because it will be complicated with, switching, unswitching.
Yeah, but you can open the mic and it's
yes.
fine. Yeah, just the mic. Thank you, Rachel.
Okay, so maybe Rachel wants to ask a question.
Okay, sure.
Actually, sorry, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. I just wanted to say thank you very much, Claire Warwick, for your very enthusiastic and eye-opening conference. And I also wanted to thank you for your book, Digital Humanities in Practice, because at one stage last year, I was thinking of taking up a position at Qatar, Doha, HBKU University. And your book was very interesting and useful for me, because you were talking earlier about, how can digital humanities grow outside the Anglo-American context? And because Qatar is very Americanized, I was having to do the opposite, going from a French digital humanities context to an Anglo-American one. So I just hope that today, I know that you already have knowledge of French digital humanities, but that you will also see some of the things that we've been doing in France over the past couple of decades. So it was more of a comment. Just thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, then I'll ask my question. I just started typing it. You mentioned that DH scholars share with scientists the fact that they create data. And if I understand well from the slides you've been showing us, sometimes they even create projects. I'm thinking of the medieval manuscripts. And I think this is a very exciting challenge for us teachers, trainers, because I'm also in English literature, and we are used to analyzing things that exist and then talking about it, maybe writing about it, but not about creating interfaces, platforms, new representations. And that's a very exciting challenge. but it doesn't sit very well with the architecture of a diploma, at least as it is established. I'm thinking of our master's students. Very often they're asked to produce a mémoire, which is a mini dissertation. And so we have the challenge of assessing these new objects. And maybe you could tell us more about how you dealt with that.
Yeah, that is, as you say, it's a very new challenge for many students who've come out of traditional humanities. What we did at UCL and what they're doing at Glasgow is we often had project work either as part of the assessment for particular courses, and particularly, as you said, for the kind of dissertation element, which all master's courses do have a dissertation element in the UK, and it's usually quite a big one. It's, you know, several months of project work. And some of the students did choose to do, many of the students, excuse me, did choose to do projects, often in collaboration with special collections, our special collections, or a museum or something like that. And what we found was that just doing the project was great, but we needed them to put it into intellectual context. So in fact, we would ask them to write a report where they reflected on what they had been doing, and they also looked at the wider intellectual context of it. And it was, in fact, therefore, in the dissertation project, it was usually the report itself about the digital object that was assessed rather than a digital object. Although in other courses, when we were teaching them about web design, they would be producing a web page themselves at one point. And it got to the point that it became so difficult to assess that, because as you got more and more automatic tools for producing websites, it was harder and harder to assess people's code, and anyway, they ought to be borrowing code from other people. So we thought about, okay, we'll ask them to actually evaluate somebody else's website rather than build one themselves. So we did have to adapt our evaluation methods, and often it was on the basis of commentary on a digital object rather than the creation of. But sometimes they had to create the object to comment on it, if you see what I mean. I think largely what will happen with a lot of the programming courses at Durham, and it did at UCL, was programming, weirdly enough, often seems to be evaluated by an unseen exam, because my colleagues in computer science are often worried that students will just rip off other people's code. So they tend to prefer unseen exams, which has of course been impossible during the pandemic last summer, and they were not happy about that, but you know, we had to. So I think we have to, a lot of the time it's getting them to think it's not just about creating the object, it's about thinking about it and thinking about its intellectual context that's extremely valuable.
Thank you. Okay, yes, there's a question from Ellie, who's online. A more theoretical, very French question. Are digital humanities helping to refine digital?
Yes, that is a really difficult question. It depends on the kind of digital humanities you're doing, I think. You know, there is some very theoretical digital humanities, people like David Berry in the Anglophone context, or Pierre Levy very much in the Francophone context. Yes, I mean, I think from that point of view, there are some people doing some very interesting work in the theory of, you know, what is a digital object? How can we think about it from a humanities perspective? And I think we do have something, even us more empirical digital humanists, we do have something to contribute in that sense, because as I've been saying, scientists and arts and humanities people think about things differently. I remember a colleague of mine at UCL being entranced by the ability to work with humanities objects of study, because they don't mean, you know, they are polysemous, they don't mean the same thing all the time to everybody. You know, mathematics, he comes out of a kind of mathematics background where, you know, mathematics is, data is, digital is, or it isn't. And he loved the idea that you would work with things where the interpretation might change, where the meaning might change. And I think therefore our ability to understand things from that humanities perspective as not fixed as, you know, changing with the way the observer observes something is actually a really big contribution to the nature of digital scholarship.
Ah oui, alors, and another question from Ellie. Does digital today mean more than technology? Is that the one?
Yes.
Gosh, that's interesting. I don't think it's quite difficult to divide it from the technology, but yes, I think it does, because I'm really interested in how people experience digital environments, and that is almost independent of the technology, because I've been looking at, and colleagues of mine and research students of mine have been looking at these questions about how do we experience digital environments emotionally. So we've been coming up with some really interesting findings which suggest that we know that we all get emotionally attached to physical objects, especially, let's say in this context of things like novels, books that we love. And we talk about, you know, how much we loved reading something like that, and we care about what's in the novel, but we actually care about the book itself. What we find is that people are, when they read the same book in digital form, they really struggle to create an emotional connection with it. And they talk about how, well, I'll read something on my iPad or my Kindle or whatever, but if I really like the book, I'll go and buy it because I want to have it. Equally, vinyl records and you know, clearly art objects, like you cannot, however good the digital reproduction is, you simply cannot reproduce the aura and the experience of seeing a beautiful art object in its proper context. So I guess that, you know, that sense of, I think there's a lot more work to be done to understand why this happens. We find that it happens, but we don't know why it happens. Hence some of the work on eye tracking and art. But therefore, I think that is, irrespective of the technology, that is our response to something digital. And it really doesn't matter what kind of technology we're using to approach that digital object. There seems to be something particular about our experience of the digital almost wherever we encounter it.
Other questions? Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions dans la salle? Okay, I think we're almost perfectly on time. Thank you very much, Claire, for this very inspiring presentation. And also on a personal note, I must say that I found the idea that digital humanities help bridge the gap with on the gender level is very interesting and very important for us as an institution, Paris 8, which is located in a rather deprived area. I think these issues should be looked into. Again, thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to now stop the recording first. Okay, so.